Thank you, Ahmed. I set my timer. So as Ahmed said, my name's Kristy Roschke, and I'm at the Arizona State University Journalism School, where I teach and I research media literacy. And I'm going to talk to you today about why we should be embedding digital media literacy into science education. And I'm really grateful for the previous presentation, because it queued up a lot of the things that I'm going to say. So just remember all of that, and then we'll carry on. So starting with some good news, recent research would indicate that trust in scientists is up. So relative to other types of professionals and other institutions, Americans generally think that scientists act in the public interest. But that's kind of that story of like, I trust my local scientist, but maybe my trust in science as an institution isn't quite as strong. So we've seen a lot of instances where there's a growing distrust in certain areas of science, and some of them have already been mentioned and will be mentioned later today. So there's this dichotomy between I trust scientists, but I'm not so sure about some scientific topics. And I think part of that reason is because there is just so much information out there. People are very confused. It's a stressful environment to be in. So if you're like me and you avoid your news notifications for days on end, you open your phone and your lock screen looks a little bit like this. And those green arrows for me indicate last weekend. Those are stories from just 2 news outlets about the coronavirus over a span of a day. So these are trusted news outlets with trusted stories, but just the amount of information is incredibly overwhelming, before we even start talking about the proliferation of misinformation and disinformation and the really bad stuff that's out there. So we really shouldn't be surprised that we're all very confused about where to go for information. There's just so much out there. And I've been very happy to see the platforms taking efforts with the coronavirus information and partnering with people like WHO and the CDC to say, if you were going to search for coronavirus, you're going to get this box that says, for trustworthy information, go here to the CDC and you can see the latest. But when I searched the coronavirus hashtag a couple of days ago, I got that box, which is very encouraging. And then right underneath it is a conspiracy theory about how coronavirus was originated in a lab. So this juxtaposition of credible information and not credible information happens to us all the time. And I think we all generally understand that our emotions often get the better of us. And yeah, I could go check out the CDC, but I could also check out this conspiracy theory, so maybe I'm going to go and do that. So despite best efforts, we're going to live in a digital world where hoaxes and conspiracy theories, propaganda are going to proliferate. Even though people are saying that they're searching for reliable sources. So again, there's a dichotomy here between what people say that they want, which is credible, trustworthy information, and a lot of the information that they click on. So people are seeking out reliable sources, and this is a global survey that Edelman does each year on trust, and 73% of people are worried about false information. But behaviors are different from worry about misinformation, and so people are still gravitating to and tend to gravitate to mis and disinformation or overhyped information. And when we're talking about health and science in particular, this is not only, unfortunate and dangerous, it can have real ramifications on people's health. So when we talk about reliable sources and you see surveys like that, what is a reliable source to people? We assign credibility in different ways. And we attach it to different types of people. And a lot of people gravitate towards people with similar interests or shared views. We talked in the last presentation about pre-existing beliefs. So when you come into, say, a Facebook group with people that you believe that you can trust, and you get bad, not professional information, it can have severe consequences, very unfortunate consequences. And a thing that concerns me is as we move away from, or we move closer to getting more information from things like smart speakers, and we're moving away from provenance and attribution as part of our, information system, and random people can provide Alexa answers to information. It just creates a situation where we're less attached to where the source of information comes from, and it creates more confusion and more problems. So, it's complicated. So media literacy is generally understood to be the ways in which people access, analyze, and interact with media. And this is a definition that I use and I really like for digital media literacy, which defines it as a set of social practices. So it's not a skill set that you learn when you're 5 or you're 12 or you're 25. It's an ongoing process throughout lifetime, and it's based on social circumstance, it's based on personal context, it's based on education and experience. And media literacy is about so much more than just verifying information. Certainly that's a big part of it, and certainly today that's the part that gets talked about most often. But when we talk about media literacy, we're really talking about how we engage with the information in our environment. And we can characterize that by collaboration and openness and interactivity around these conversations in a way that it can feel, when we're just looking at social media, like that's not happening. And what I like to present today is there's an opportunity in subject areas that aren't related to media, like science and health, to bridge subject matter and the related media environment around it. So I think we all typically understand, say, science classes to be where we go and learn scientific information from scientific sources, from science subject matter experts, and traditional popular media is typically not, it doesn't enter into that equation. And whether it's not seen as trustworthy or credible, or it's just not part of the conversation, I think that that's very unfortunate because it discounts the ways in which we're all interacting with information. Even those of us who are subject matter experts are still Googling things all the time. And that we're not talking about that in classrooms, I think, is a big missed opportunity. Recent research would indicate that young people do use news. And I think that this is relevant information for people that interact with young people of all ages, but in this presentation, I'm kind of specifically thinking of undergraduates. But more than 75% of US teens follow current events. And a project information literacy study that I found especially interesting shows that most college students are interacting and talking about news on a weekly basis. And most of that happens on digital and social platforms, but it also happens among peers, and it does happen in classrooms. This survey found that social sciences, English classrooms, history classrooms are more inclined to bring current events into the classroom than STEM subjects, though, which again I think is a missed opportunity because professors can model and demonstrate engagement with traditional media in a way that can be useful for students. And just a little bit more from that project information literacy study. It's, again, there's these dueling ideas that information and the amount of it can be very overwhelming, but our ability to use it via digital and social and to make it a social practice can also be very empowering. And I like to work with my students on sort of this empowerment side of it. Is how do we harness this information for conversation and to learn more and to sort of not act from a deficit model and not talk about the fear and the confusion, but rather to talk about how we can make it better. I teach a class on digital media literacy, and every semester I ask my students to track their media use for 24 hours, and I am astounded every time by their answers, and I've been doing this for about 6 or 7 years, and the answers have changed dramatically over 6 or 7 years. And so here's just a few of the icons of the most common responses. YouTube these days is far and away the place that they're at most, not only for entertainment purposes, but for news purposes. You'll see news aggregators, social platforms, and then some traditional media outlets there. There's also anecdotally an increase in students who are listening to podcasts. So this is super interesting to me because I don't use a lot of these platforms myself, and I'm a media instructor. So I use this as an opportunity to ask my students more questions. So you go to YouTube for news. What does that mean? Who's giving you this news on YouTube? Who are these people that are providing this information? And chances are, in a lot of cases, they're providing other people's information. So it's an opportunity to, do an exercise in sourcing. When the YouTube personality is talking about a big story that hit, where did that person get their information? So all kinds of conversations can abound on subjects related to science and health when you start to ask students about where they're finding their information. And I'd also like to point out that if we're operating in this world where I'm assuming you're getting information from someplace and you're actually getting it from someplace else, we're not having the same conversation. And until we can kind of address these gaps, we can't really get to the root of the problem. So again, a lot of attention these days around media literacy is around verification and whether or not we can determine a source is credible or if it's fake news, all of those words that we see in the media a lot. And I'm certainly not here to say that that's not important because absolutely it is. It's part and parcel of media literacy. But I'd also like to point out that it's a practice, again, I said that, that begets participation and collaboration and evaluation in a way that doesn't just have to be, is this picture true or false? And for teachers, professors, parents who have different subject matter expertise, sometimes there's a reluctance to teach about media if you're not an expert in media, but you're an expert in your subject matter. And there's media about pretty much every scientific topic. So when you broach it from your subject area and you bring popular media into the classroom, you're not only making it more accessible to the students, but you're acknowledging and you're respecting that traditional news sources and information sources are really where we're getting a lot of our information. And though we would love our students to only access our library databases and read peer-reviewed scholarly journals, and surely we will assign those and continue to expect our students to read those and talk about them in class, that doesn't discount the popular media and the experience that they're experiencing outside your classroom. And it also doesn't change the fact that when you give them an assignment, they're going to Google it first. 100%, that's what they're going to do. So how do you help them find information in a Google search or a Wikipedia search that can lead you to the things that maybe you're, as an instructor, more comfortable with? And this should be happening in all classrooms. It's not just science and health or media or history. This can be a conversation that any professor, any teacher has with people at any time. And I think it really values the young people's media experience, values their experience when you ask them about their media use. So I think it's an important thing to be doing across the board. It's not just a singular subject area that should be relegated to its own class. And then the last kind of point I want to make is that, and this was said in the previous presentation a little bit too, subject matter knowledge doesn't necessarily increase trust in science, and it definitely doesn't equate the ability to find and use credible sources about a topic. If you've taken a Bio 101 class like I did in college, I may have learned about biology, but I definitely didn't learn about what trusted sources for biology subjects are. That was not what this class was about. And I think a conversation about what are those trusted institutions for information should come from science instructors. There was a lot of talk already today about consensus reports, which I think is fantastic. But what lay audience understands what consensus reports really do, and which consensus report is trustworthy and which one is sponsored by a think tank that has alternative agendas? These conversations, I don't think, come up enough in science classes when we're talking about bias and funding and all those things that can be good and bad about scientific discovery. As we're talking about the way that we create knowledge, we should also talk about the way that we create information. Those things are like inextricable from one another. So I would implore everyone in a position to sort of interrogate some of these questions in the classroom. Do typical people know how to find good consensus documents on things and understand what that means? Do they have access to quality information? And if not, how can you help them gain access? And then how do we evaluate scholarly research on a single study level, on a consensus level, on a trend level? And importantly, how do we then also examine the press coverage related to those scholarly journal articles and research, because sometimes there's problems there. These are things that can happen across a course, and you don't really have to put too much effort into them, I think, and I think they would engender a lot of really interesting conversation and help people have, just fine-tune their knowledge about the information that they consume. And something I do, I wouldn't expect you to be able to read these, but in my classroom we do a lot of discussion around this, and I have found both in my classroom anecdotal experience and in my research that the more people are talking about these issues, obviously the better their understanding. I think it kind of feels like common sense, but it is a practice and we must practice it to have a better understanding. And these are just examples of students talking to each other. They don't have to talk to you. They can make sense of these things through conversation with each other, scaffolded by a conversation in the classroom. So we have lots of tools and tips that on how to help students with credibility and find good sources on our website if that's of interest to you. And you can follow us and me on Twitter, and happy to have you reach out if you'd like more information. Thank you.